Welcome to our next panel discussion, Redefining Victory in Ukraine. As the war in Ukraine continues to unfold, the concept of victory has become increasingly complex and multifaceted. In this session, we will explore the evolving nature of the conflict and what victory truly means for Ukraine, its allies, and the international community. Our distinguished panelists include Maxim, Ukraine and Eastern Europe correspondent for The Times, Nathalie Tocci, Director of the Institute for Foreign Relations, Oleksandr Chalyi, Associate Fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and Velina Tchakarova, founder of FACE, for a Conscious Experience. The discussion will be moderated by Aleksandra Godfroid, producer and reporter for N1 Television. Please join me. Here.
Here we are. Извините. Можемо да почнемо, да. So, yeah, we can start, I think. We can start. Thank you all for being with us today on this panel of Redefining Victory in Ukraine. And my first question to you all is quite simple and yet the most difficult one, probably, and that is, how does this war end? But keep in mind, will it be fair? Mr. Tucker?
Well, I think we've crept into a narrative now of Russia is strong, Russia is powerful, and Russia is intransigent. So the only option that we have is to pressure Kyiv to come to the table, to pressure the victim to make concessions in order for the aggressor to come to a peace deal. And I think, given the history of this conflict going back to 2014, when we've seen ceasefire agreement after ceasefire agreement violated by the Russians, culminating obviously in the 2022 invasion, I think that approach really is futile, because you can see that the Russians are not content to stay where they are now. Putin has greater territorial ambitions. He hasn't shifted his position on that. He continues to say, Ukraine has no right to exist. He was recently talking at the Valdai Club about how there are lots of Russian speakers in Kharkiv, there are lots of Russian speakers in the Odessa region. He will continue to look for ways to assert his territorial claims over Ukraine. And I think the only option in coming to a lasting peace is ultimately to defeat Russia in this. And it looks like it's difficult, it is difficult, but there are still certain things that we can do in order to achieve that we haven't tried yet. And I think we'll come on to that a bit later, won't we? So I'll go into more detail.
Yes, of course. So, are you sharing this optimism?
Connected to what was being said, I think at the moment there seems to be an assumption that most people are making, and I would just, I think it's important to question it. And I think the assumption goes a little bit like this: well, sort of things are going the way they're going. Here comes Donald Trump. He has a plan. We know that plan doesn't look great for Ukraine, certainly not compared to what Ukraine and its supporters in the West have been talking about. However, obviously, the United States has massive leverage on Ukraine, and it can essentially arm twist Ukraine into accepting it. And, you know, sort of Putin can take that deal because, as I said, it's a fairly good deal for Russia. I think that's a very big assumption to make, and I'm not sure at all that this is the way in which things are going to play out. Because even if, and you may say, well, so what deal are we talking about? Yeah. Well, I mean, we don't know exactly what's going to come from the White House, but, you know, if we look at the kind of things that have been, you know, sort of partly leaked, partly debated, and I think just kind of basic common sense, we can kind of assume that the contours of that deal would be some sort of de facto recognition, not de jure recognition, of what Russia has already occupied. It would entail no NATO membership. Frankly speaking, Ukraine is not on the cusp of entering NATO anyway. It might include some sort of, you know, European peacekeeping. I mean, Europeans are kind of weak and, you know, fragmented anyway, so no big deal for Russia. Question mark over EU membership, and we discussed this in the previous session. So, as I said, this may apparently look like a pretty good deal for Putin. But if Putin thinks that he's on a roll, and, you know, when is he going to get this opportunity again? I'm not at all clear that even something that if we put ourselves in Russia, in Putin's shoes, we might think he may buy into this, at least temporarily, right? And then perhaps, you know, take a couple of years, regroup, rearm, and then go for the next chunk of European territory and peoples in a couple of years' time. I'm not at all sure that this is the way in which Vladimir Putin actually thinks. And so I think, coming to your question, how does this war end? I think the real question is, does the war actually end? Because whereas we kind of, you know, there was an element of predictability in the way in which the US and Europeans supported Ukraine up until now, which was basically kind of support them with a hand tied behind their back, I'm not sure that if we get to the situation in which a deal is presented, the deal is rebuffed, I'm not sure that the US under the Trump administration would actually react in the same way as has been the case over the last almost 3 years under the Biden administration.
Yeah. Your Excellency, does the war end?
Okay. First of all, I express my gratitude for invitation to organizers of Belgrade Security Conference. Second, I deliver my speech or my ideas only in personal capacity. It's very important. I am retired ambassador and in some sense diplomatic volunteer. To my mind, because of Russia illegal annexation of 6 Ukrainian regions, it's up to 20% of Ukrainian territories. Now it's impossible to end this war through any peace agreement, legally binding peace agreement. Why? Because to conclude this agreement, it's necessary to change Russian constitution. But according with Russian constitution, it's impossible to change Russian constitution with reduction of Russia territory. It's a new amendments to Russian constitution. So to my mind, exists only one possible way to end the war, to end hostilities, to establish ceasefire, and it's not depends where we establish this ceasefire, on the line of present of contact on the battlefield or on the borders of 91 of Ukraine. Because imagine tomorrow Ukraine liberate all our territories within the border of 91. Russia not stop the war, because Russia considered that we illegally occupied constitutional Russia territory. So my first message, to one possibility to end this war only through ceasefire regime. My second message, under what conditions this is future ceasefire or cessation of hostility will be fair? It's your question. To my mind, our officials and me personally formulate very clear 3 preconditions. Any ending of hostilities should be done without any prejudice for territorial integrity of Ukraine within the borders of 91. Second preconditions, neither regulations, future regulations of the ending of the war should be made without any prejudice for future reparation from Russia to Ukraine and future punishment of Russia criminals for war crimes. And third, Ukraine agree only with such cessation of hostilities which will be guarantees as much as possible, like mechanism of guarantees of ceasefire in Korea or like situation in Cyprus. We need very guaranteed ceasefire mechanism, and after the hostilities, Ukraine needs a substantial military package aid to guarantee Ukraine capability for sufficient deterrence of Russia for some long period of time, and a real package of financial aid for rebuilding Ukraine in post-war period. So, finally, the only one way now to end the war, this is to transfer the hot phase of this war in the cold phase of this war.
What do you say? Is that possible, this transference? What is, to you, the end of the war? How this war ends, Mr. Chalyi?
Well, obviously, from tactical point of view, that means the short-term perspective for the next 1 to 2 years. And let me clarify that I've been saying that this war is going beyond 2025, 2026, already in 2023. It looks like there's not going to be a military victory for any of the conflict parties. So obviously, the military dimension is still going to continue. And I do agree that this, in my view, is a war that can actually last for the next 5, 8, 10 years, depending on Russia's abilities, not on Russia's willingness, because Russia's ultimate goal in this war is still the same, only tactically there have been changes to the ultimate goal. That is the full subjugation of Ukraine. That is the destruction of the European security order and creating a new security order on the old continent along the Russian interests. And that is a pole position in the new Cold War 2.0 between United States and China, emerging stronger from a military or whatever kind of victory and from destroying the European security order. That is Russia. Now, coming back to the tactical perspective, here, of course, we may argue that Ukraine might start any kind of negotiations from a position of strength or from a position of weakness, and that very much depends, of course, on the Western support. That means, is the narrative of the escalation going to let's say, precede and take over, or is the understanding that we need to actually support Ukraine as much as possible, as quickly as possible, which, by the way, was the European and the Western approach from day one, namely, whatever it takes, military and any kind of comprehensive aid, Western sanctions and international diplomacy. This has been the three-dimensional approach of the West, and now, to me, personally, the question here is the West going to step back from its own approach, saying that, okay, Russia has stronger, position because of, let's say, the new realities on the ground, or let's say, the realities on the global arena, and we should accommodate, which I think is very dangerous approach, very dangerous not only for Ukraine, but also specifically for Europe, or is the West going to say, okay, now we need to actually put Ukraine in the strongest position possible for any kind of negotiations, for any kind of talks, because what I see is a possibility for talks, a possibility for probably ceasefire talks, but no sustainable peace settlement for 2025, 2026.
Isn't it a bit not to say late, but some opportunities might have been missed, because like just recently, Mr. Borrell said that, for instance, the 1 million shells for Ukraine were 8.5 months late. And we know that this kept on happening, weapons being too late, the promised ones.
This is exactly what I'm alluding to.
Yeah.
That we, in fact, have come up with a very good approach how to support Ukraine from the very beginning. By we, I mean, of course, the West, the European and the American partners and the international partners. And we haven't sticked to our plan. When it comes to the military aid, we haven't provided what we promised. We've created imaginative red lines in every phase of delivery, in every time when we actually decided, and right now we have the most recent example also with the long-range missiles that finally were approved, well, 2 years later. I mean, this is exactly the point. But also when it comes to international diplomacy, we are not the only players on the arena. Russia has been doing its homework as well, trying to convince partners in the Global South that it also has a peace plan, that it also has actually an idea about how to end this war. And now we are seeing that countries like China, Brazil, are also offering peace plans that are very much in line with most of the Russian interests. And the last point, sanctions, very important. Yes, indeed, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world right now. We've really come up with very sustainable plan on sanctions, and even now we are continuing to launch sanctions. But again, if you take a look at the numbers, if you take a look at the statistics, you will see that we are also bypassing our own sanctions via Russia's proxies.
Yes. Maxim, you were just recently came back from Ukraine, and you are there very, very frequently. So you are the right person to ask as outsider when it comes to Ukraine, in a sense you're not Ukrainian. How is the mood changed in Ukraine? What is acceptable for Ukrainians themselves as the outcome of the war? How they are feeling?
So this is the kind of the million-dollar question, isn't it? What would Ukrainians actually accept in this situation? And I think that, to me, it seems the mood had quite drastically shifted after Donald Trump's election. The people in the presidential administration are very concerned, not just about the way that Donald Trump will impose his plan on them, but what happens in the interim. I mean, no one really believes that the peace is going to come in a day. So if there's extended negotiations and US deliveries, arms deliveries are not arriving, that's going to have really catastrophic effects for the Ukrainians on the battlefield. There is some optimism in the idea that if Trump is really going through with his plan and Putin kind of goes along with these ceasefire negotiations but doesn't actually follow through on them, Trump, given his temperament, might get frustrated and actually say, okay, we'll give all the support to Ukraine it needs, and it becomes a kind of staring match between Trump and Putin. But I think we also have to remember, Donald Trump has built his business empire on Russian money. There's a lot of Russian money and a lot of connections there. And the Ukrainians are also very aware of that. Their intelligence services have been looking at those connections for a long time. And the conclusions that they come to are not great.
And about the weapons all constantly being laid, I know that you were doing reportages from the front line, and you spoke with the soldiers. How do they feel that? Do they feel that as a sort of a betrayal? Maybe that's a strong word, but...
I think there's a really strong feeling of betrayal from the Ukrainian soldiers, because they felt that with the counteroffensive that they might have a chance of winning this if they were given the things that they needed. After Russia had been driven out of Kyiv and Kharkiv and Kherson, there was a feeling that actually Ukraine can do this. Russia is disorganized, it's not ready for this war. And if the West had given everything that Ukraine needed, particularly air support at that time, then maybe they could have been more successful in their counteroffensive. And during that counteroffensive, they took very, very heavy casualties. I mean, obviously they would have done. They had no air support. I mean, it's very strange to me that American generals battle planned this offensive without giving Ukraine air support. So that in itself was a betrayal. And now the kind of continued drip of weapons is not nearly enough to sustain even a defensive action, let alone an offensive action. You know, I've spoken to brigade commanders who say, we've got 2 tanks from 27 that we can use because we've only got 30 shells a day. You know, others who say, you know, we can only wheel out our Bradleys now and again because they, you know, we don't have enough of them in store to repair if one gets hit. So these are, every kind of delay has a very serious consequence in terms of lives on the battlefield, and soldiers are feeling that more than anyone.
Yeah. We talk a lot about the fact that with the election of Donald Trump, things changed. I mean, this victory is also not something unexpected in a certain sense. But do you, Nathalie, think that he is going to throw, and under what circumstances, both Ukraine and Europe and its security under a bus, so to say?
Well, I mean, I think he will try. But as I said, I think the real question has less to do with what Donald Trump will do. I think, to me, the real question marks have to do both, as I said, with how Russia will react, and then the next step after that is how the Europeans are going to react. And I think you can sort of paint 2 different scenarios here. So you have, in a sense, scenario 1 in which Putin takes the bait. As I said, not necessarily because I think, as you were rightly saying, this will lead to a peace deal, but it could lead to some sort of temporary truce, let's say. So that's one scenario which I think then opens up a particular kind of dilemma for Europeans, because it's a dilemma whereby Europeans, you could say, well, militarily, they would at least have, if we assume that this is not the end of the war, right? Militarily, at least they would say, well, okay, fine, you know, it gives us a little bit of more time to, you know, ramp up those capacities, you know, to, you know, be involved and provide those security guarantees for Ukraine. The minute in which those security guarantees are perhaps even provided through some peacekeeping, you essentially become involved, in a sense, in the security of the country itself. So militarily, it has, in a sense, certain implications. Politically, though, it has a potentially far more divisive effect on Europe, because inevitably, in a situation in which Trump makes the offer, Putin pretends, there will be some countries in Europe that will, you know, particularly in North and Eastern Europe, that will say, this is just, you know, this is a scam, right? And so they will try and stand against. There are other countries, certainly my own, that will fold, yeah? The question mark is the way in which Berlin will react. You would have imagined that under the current government, which has now fallen, it would have also folded. Unclear what a next government, obviously, the position that they would take. So anyway, I think there's a question of political divide in Europe in that scenario in which Putin takes the bait. As opposed to another scenario in which Putin does not take the bait, and therefore war continues, which in a sense, in a scenario in which Trump throws Ukraine under the bus, creates a far graver military problem for Europe, because obviously Putin does not take the bait, US is checking out, you know, sort of obviously this puts the entire onus onto Europeans. But politically it has a far more unifying effect, because the minute in which Putin says no, well, we can only stick together.
Yes, or there are some countries which say, well, he's not that big a threat.
No, I think that in a scenario in which, I think that scenario is there where there's the pretense of taking the agreement. I think in a scenario in which Russia says, no, we just simply want to continue, I think it would become very, very difficult for any European country, including those that would like to fold, to actually fold in that scenario.
Now, Mr. Chalyi, you laid out a plan that you think is possible and that for sure, in a sense of fairness as well, cannot exclude, for instance, reparations and all sorts of things which would be quite favorable. But at the very beginning of this war, in March, when the negotiations were going on in Istanbul, you were there. So please tell us what went wrong in Istanbul. Why the war didn't end then?
Okay, but before I give some comments on Istanbul process, I want to stress very important things for us, for Ukrainians. It's possible to discuss different scenarios, but for us exist some very strategic principles. We are victims of aggression. It's a recognizable fact. It's the first. Second, from this point of view, for us, victory have a very clear meaning. strategically, it's impossible to redefining victory for us, because this victory are very clearly defined by modern international law. What victory means for us strategically? That Russia aggressor stop aggression, restore international order, withdraw their troops on the border 91, pay reparation, punish criminals, and give guarantees that the war, new Russia aggression, will be not repeated in the future. It's for us strategical vision of victory. But from point of view of time, point of view of methods, which we use to reach this strategic victory, we can redefine victory perception. For example, after the occupation, illegal occupation of Crimea, we prefer to use only political, diplomatical means to reach victory. After the large-scale invasion, we change on the first stage during the Istanbul process. We also try to combine military means and diplomatic means. After the May 22, we use only military means. To my mind, now it's time to back to diplomacy. And President Zelensky a few times admitted officially that it's possible under some conditions to return back to diplomacy. But our crucial conditions is sustainable security guarantee mechanism. A country which gave up that stockpile, nuclear stockpile in world under Budapest Memorandum have a special privilege now after Budapest guarantees failed to demand reliable, effective, and real security guarantees. The best security guarantees for Ukraine now, and this is idea supported by majority of Ukrainian population, it's even despite of ceasefire on the line of contact, to be member of NATO with application of Article 5 of NATO till the line of ceasefire. It's the best solution for us. In Istanbul, we negotiate the same. The crucial idea of Istanbul was to end hostilities, to restart peaceful negotiation, and Istanbul, it was possible, because in Istanbul, Russia did not illegally annex huge part of Ukrainian territory. So in Istanbul existed chance to finish this war with the peace agreement. Now, as I mentioned, no chance. But why Istanbul failed? I gave a few comments, short comments. Generally, Istanbul failed because in that moment, for key policymakers all over the world, continuation of the war was a less political price than ending of the war. It's general observation. But from point of view of facts, look, it's necessary to do differences between Istanbul communique, which was concluded 29th of March in Istanbul, and a later text which Mr. Putin demonstrated on TV. It's a different document. In this later text, unfortunately, Russia Federation withdrew some most important provisions for Ukraine which were fixed in Istanbul communique. It was two. The first one, we demanded security guarantees equal Article 5 of NATO. And Article 5 of Istanbul communique, it was the same text, even legally stricter, as Article 5 of NATO. But Russia later, on level of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, demanded veto right that if in future Ukraine will be object of military attack or special military operation, it will be necessary consensus among all guarantee states to help Ukraine. It will be like veto right in Security Council. For us, it was totally impossible.
So in the case Russia would attack Ukraine again, and then Russia would have to agree to help.
So for us, it was totally impossible. The second, the most strategic element was that Russia started negotiation with total ultimatum, immediately recognized independence of so-called Donetsk and Lugansk Republic, and Russia sovereignty rights over Crimea. Finally, we persuade Russia to agree to disagree on territorial questions. We return back in Istanbul communique provisions that next 15 years we plan to discuss future status of Crimea. Before it, it was very strong taboo. From Russia, they regret to discuss any status of Crimea because it was closed question. And Russia, and we use such legal tactics. We declare in Istanbul communique that future security guarantees equal Article 5 of NATO will not be applicable to the territory of Ukraine, which Ukraine not effectively control. This is Ordlo, so-called Ordlo, and Crimea. And we negotiate with returning back our territories only diplomatically. But Russia also changed. This is in project which Putin demonstrates to the date of this project. This is 15th of April 2022. So we, in March 14, put our, in brackets, ultimatum before Russia delegation. If they not change or not withdraw their amendments to Istanbul original text, we are withdrawing our future participation in negotiation. And Russia never formally give us answer that they withdraw. This is a new text which not corresponds to the Istanbul communique. It's the first. Second, to my mind, we have a chance. And now it's very difficult to return back to the whole text of Istanbul. But Putin many times appealed to Istanbul and even declared that he is ready to implement of Istanbul. To my mind, this is two elements in Istanbul. Security guarantees of Ukraine equal Article 5 of NATO, the best solution membership of NATO till the line of ceasefire. And second, that in any other agreement on ending hostilities or ending of war of Ukraine, Ukraine never agreed to transfer sovereignty right of Ukraine to Russia. So the most important things in future negotiations, this is agreement to disagree on territorial status and to postpone this territorial status for future diplomatic negotiations, which maybe continue 20, 30 years. It's up to God who decide final fair decision on restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty of a border of 91.
Ms. Chalyi, so we hear that basically also some Western countries were not very willing in Istanbul to do these guarantees as an estimation. Then Putin came with a different plan that basically annulled all these guarantees with this weight of power. Do you think now they would be willing to give the security guarantees without which, indeed, Ukraine, there is no point in ceasefire?
Define whom do you mean by they?
West?
Who are they?
Western Europe?
The collective West?
Yes.
The Americans, the European powers, NATO?
Okay, let me rephrase that. Who do you think would be willing to give the security guarantees?
Yeah, I think that this is
Maybe
more... Please, Ambassador.
Please answer. What you personally, what kind of security guarantees you personally propose to Ukraine?
No, if you have an addition to the answer, I will be delighted to hear your response. My problem here is that promising security guarantees is a necessary condition, but having the credibility of security guarantees, that means coming to the rescue, is actually the sufficient condition I'm missing. To me personally, just promising security guarantees, and we've already seen several such actually cases of coming from European countries that have signed agreements with Ukraine on bilateral security guarantees. This is important. This is the necessary condition. What I want to see happening is a collective step towards defining a will, not only to announce security guarantees, but to stick to them. That comes a little bit along with the promise, or let's say the announcement, and you remember what kind of reaction it unleashed by the French President Macron when he said, if necessary, NATO troops will be also sent to Ukraine. And of course, he meant that part of Ukraine that you also identified now as one territory that could actually join NATO in the future. That should be the territory if in any kind of context of negotiations and talks has to be protected by the West. I would expect that the full package means also military presence in preparation of NATO membership. Now, if you ask me about my realistic view on the matter, because one topic is normative thinking, what we wish to happen. But another thing is what we realistically expect to happen. And here I fear that once again, because of political constraints at home, for instance, think of elections in Germany, think of presidential election in France in 2027, election in Germany in February 2025, that key European powers might actually announce one thing, but again send a different message to the world, namely that they are not going to stick to such promises. In reality, what I see happening in longer time frame is practically a re-emergence of a kind of an Iron Curtain 2.0 along the eastern flank of NATO, including all of the territory of Ukraine that is legitimately and credibly part of Ukraine, and that has to be protected as such in case of further attacks by Russia, because let's be real about it. Any negotiations, any ceasefire talks, any freezing of the conflict proposals, all of this actually is favorable to Russian interests. That has been the modus operandi of Russia for a very, very long time. That's actually detrimental, in general, detrimental to Ukrainian and by extension, European Union interests.
Very short reaction.
Just a second,
because it's very important. You were speaking about credibility of security guarantees for Ukraine. After Budapest Memorandum, for us, only legally binding, ratified by parliaments of appropriate country, treaty with clear provision to Ukraine, boots on the ground and nuclear umbrella under Ukraine will be reliable and credible security guarantees. It's our position.
Yes,
well,
please.
Well, exactly. I wanted to say something connected precisely to this. I mean, I actually think that I agree with Velina in the sense that security guarantees just on paper, I must say, even if they're legally binding, I think are necessary but insufficient. I actually think that what we're talking about to make this credible is actually a situation in which the discussion over guarantees and over deterrence are actually one and the same thing, right? Because it is only the minute in which Europeans, I struggle, frankly speaking, to see the US moving this direction, but Europeans actually co-participate in a sense, I mean, are kind of embedded within, in a sense, Ukraine itself and Ukraine's security. Now, that is going to create an incentive to do something, right? And therefore will act as deterrents. So I think these two things really need to be taken together, whether we're looking at it in terms of peacekeeping and boots on the ground, whether we're talking about it in terms of military capacity and the maintenance of those military capacities. Those are the real guarantees. Yeah, then the piece of paper obviously is important, but it's insufficient. I do, though, think that while I think this discussion is extremely important, and hopefully this is the world that we're headed into, we should at the same time be thinking about the opposite scenario. As I said, a scenario in which war continues, and what is it that we can and should be doing in that kind of scenario? They're not necessarily completely sort of separate discussions, because we still have to stick together and we still need to ramp up support militarily for Ukraine in a situation in which the US either abruptly or gradually, in a sense, checks out of European security. But I think that's as important as in a sense, more optimistic discussion in terms of what is it that we can do to secure a potential truce.
Yes, but all this is, we're talking about destinies of real people. millions, tens of millions of Ukrainians that went through, well, today is actually 1,000 days of war in Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you, Maxim, how did this war change them? And all these discussions in theory about security guarantees and stuff like that, how do Ukrainians, to your feeling and knowledge, take it?
Well, it's important to understand that it's a total war, right? So an entire society at war, everyone is affected by it in one way or another. I mean, I've met people who 3 years ago, they were a student, they were a teacher, they were a musician, and now they're kind of special forces operators who go out on jet skis and raid Crimea and attack oil rigs. You know, it's an extraordinary transformation of these people that they will never be able to come back from. I mean, it's changed. There's going to be a dark side to Ukraine for years and years to come, for generations, I would have thought. And you've got a lot of people who are losing limbs. It's visible in the streets. So, and a lot of psychological trauma as well. But there has been, and I think this was key to Ukrainians persevering in the first few years of this war, is that, you know, there was a sense of unity, there was extreme bravery, and there was a sense of hope as well that kept them going. And now we start to see the unity fraying because we don't really know what's going to happen. There's not a clear picture. Zelensky is thought to be becoming a little bit toxic. His mandate has expired, and the hope is slipping away. So those two ingredients, I mean, I think there'll still be astonishing bravery, but those two ingredients are really important to Ukraine, and I think we should be looking for ways in which we can bolster them. I mean, I think that the discussion about Article 5, I can see why Ukraine would want that, but if you think about the logical conclusion of it, that means a ceasefire violates and NATO goes to war with Russia. Now, are any NATO countries actually going to agree to that? And, you know, what is a ceasefire violation? Is it 5 shells over the border? Is it 100 shells over the border? You know, we watch ceasefire violations all the time from 2014 to 2018. So, you know, that would be actually quite a difficult decision to make. I think, you know, a more realistic solution for Ukraine, perhaps, is to have an air policing mission like we saw over Israel, where, you know, missiles are shot down instead of falling on Ukrainian cities in western Ukraine. You have NATO troops in western Ukraine training Ukrainian troops, which will save lives, as they did from 2014 onwards. It was a terrible mistake to withdraw them in 2022. And we really need to ratchet up the sanctions regime. I mean, we have quite a good raft of sanctions, but the way they're enforced is not good. And there are very, very few resources being put into that. You know, given the scale of the resources that we're talking about, the billions and billions that are of trade that are still going through, and the essential kind of items that still reach Russia that are essential to their war machine, there should be, in recognizing the global security implications, there should be very, very seriously resourced task forces that go after them, not just in the US, but across Europe. And Europe has really, really dropped the ball on that.
Yeah, but, I mean, we have another side in this war, and that is the invader side. Russia's side. I mean, we saw all this alleged plan, possible plan, about, you know, some peacekeeping mission. I mean, I don't think Russia would ever agree to that. What would you say? And yeah,
this is my
question
point,
for all
exactly.
of you.
But look, to my mind, now exists strategically window of opportunity to end hostilities in nearest future. Why? Because for the first time, the strategic aims of United States, which will be formulated by President Trump, and Chinese are coincide. Because what the key aims of Trump proposals? To end the war through ceasefire on the line of contact. The same in joint China-Brazil plan. So if China and the United States will be at the same position, and EU, I 100% support this position, I am sure Russia have no chance. Then,
well, yeah, but this presupposes, I think, a key point, which I think is worth making explicit. That presupposes that in the same way as there would be a, let's call it, US arm twisting on Ukraine, there would be a Chinese arm twisting on Russia. So far, I haven't quite seen the signals in this direction.
But we have a strategic possibility, fantastic strategic possibility. And the Trump election created a new strategic context, which really gives us chance to end hostilities in Ukraine. It's my first. And second, today we mark 1,000 days of Ukrainian war. It's a sad and heroic date because 1,000 days Ukrainian army, Ukrainian nation resist country and resist global security and peace. And from this point of view, my key message, we won this war in May 22 because we survive as independent, sovereign state with our government and with our right to choose our way of development. The key challenge for us, and what we ask now the world, international community, to help us to end this war in just way, with sustainable ceasefire, like Korea case or Cyprus case.
Ms. Chalyi, I see that you have some disagreement on some issues.
No, not really disagreement, but we had already this conversation with the ambassador just 2 weeks ago at a very important event in Kyiv. And I said, actually, and I will have to say it again, I hope you will not be triggered by that, that if that is the case, and I do agree with you that there is an overlapping interest by the United States under Trump 2.0 and the Chinese leadership now to at least bring about some sort of ceasefire and some, let's say, preliminary end of hostilities, but then this would be put in a new geopolitical context, that is the context of the first proxy war, between United States and China, where China obviously, and by the way, I said that before the war broke out in 2020, and I was the first to say that Russia would have never launched a full-scale war on the 24th of February 2020 if it had not relied on the long-term comprehensive support by China. And at that time, there was a lack of understanding of the strategic dimension of the war. There was an understanding of the tactical, the operative, and the European context. But it wasn't really in the mindset of the European decision makers. And this means, of course, a significant change in global geopolitics. It means that the fate of Ukraine will be decided by a new systemic rivalry between the United States and China, where Russia obviously has sided with Beijing prior to taking also the decision on making such a move, which also brings me to the next point, and that is that betting on the one side here, but also trying to play the wild card in the new systemic rivalry, Russia is no longer the systemic player, but Russia is looking for a pole position, is trying to be some sort of the new wild card in a extremely problematic relationship between Trump and Xi Jinping, and is going to talk to both sides, which creates, of course, an amazing optics for the Russian President Putin, because we know for a fact that he likes to be photographed and seen with all these international leaders. He wants to show that he's not internationally isolated. And unfortunately, we have to recognize that right now, there is also a kind of overlapping of a geopolitical interest when it comes to Trump 2.0. That is that, Trump does not want two fronts wars. He wants to focus on China. In a long term, he wants to finish all other wars. And if it's still too early, if we see a new kind of leadership, new kind of team that is very much reluctant to actually continue the American support for Ukraine. And I mean, of course, not only military support, I mean financial, political support, diplomatic, and so on and so forth. Then we have to ask the inconvenient question in 2025. What is our European response to that reality? Because what is Europe's role in this newly emerging kind of Cold War 2.0 between the United States on the one hand and the dragon bear that is China, Russia on the other hand? And how is Ukraine turning not only into a collateral, geopolitical collateral in this, but how are we also being dragged into it by being irresponsive or by actually formulating very weak response right now to this reality?
What should be the response? of this new reality?
I think that I clearly outlined right at the beginning of our conversation that we have come up with a really good approach right from the beginning. The three-dimensional approach. First, whatever it takes to Ukraine, we should start delivering. Simply sticking to our promises, what we've promised. Second point I said, and it was already mentioned also by Maxim, sanctions policy. Stick to what you actually launch. When you bypass as a European member state your own sanctions by actually buying the Russian commodities on the global markets via Russian proxies and then placing the premium price on your own citizens, and then, you know, you have inflationary effects, you have political turbulences, and you have troubles with your economy. Probably you should be more honest with yourself as a political decision makers and say, okay, we have to refine this approach. The approach itself is working because we've seen for a fact that Russian economy has been struggling and is still struggling, but the Russian economy is also adapting to the new reality. And here is the next point, the politically inconvenient point of launching at least partially and at least closer to Ukrainian border, some sort of war economy in a sense of making sure that the production of shells and the production of weapon systems that we have promised is really becoming a reality. Third point, international diplomacy, the global arena. Why is it that the global south, right now there is a very important G20 summit in Brazil. The Ukrainian president is not invited. Russian president is not coming because of the ICC, decision. But what is our contribution to convincing the world that this is not just a war about territory or about sovereignty? This is the only extinction war in 2024. We are dealing with a reality since 2022 of an extinction war in the field of international relations. If Russia succeeds with this extinction war, there is going to be a Pandora box being opened by other geopolitical players using the means of war to create new geopolitical realities on the ground.
I buy everything. Can I just say so? I buy everything that you've just said. I do, though, think, and this connects to this whole discussion over the global south, there is another extinction war going on, and it's in the Middle East. And our position as the West and as Europe has been totally degraded, delegitimized as a consequence of that. Until we fix that, look at the results now with the G20. Just last year, there were 7 paragraphs on Ukraine. Now there's 1. If we were to take a vote at the UN General Assembly rehashing exactly the same resolutions that were passed in 2022, we would not get 140 states in favor. So until we address that particular problem, which is much broader, which has less to do with Ukraine as being, and I think you're absolutely right, a war between the global West and the global East, but obviously interacts with the global North, global South dimension, which has a lot more to do with the Middle East. And these things obviously intersect. Unless we address that piece of the equation, very difficult to see how we can get out of this.
Just a sec, because we have to also give opportunity to the audience, if there is anybody with a question, to please ask your questions to Mr. Ambassador to Serbia, Volodymyr. Yeah, please. Sorry.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this discussion. And second, I'm highly appreciate for my former colleague, Mr. Aleksandr. He mentioned today is 1,000 days. Today we mark 1,000 days of our bloody struggle, full-scale war. It's not conflict, it's war and aggression. So we lost every these days our defenders, our boys and our girls our parents. We lost our children. More than 200.5 children died during this war. Only yesterday, 14 our citizens, civilian citizens, died in Odessa and Sumy. So, first of all, I would be highly appreciate you for 1 minute of silence for all of our victims of this war, because today it's 1,000 days of this war. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Героям слава. Second, I would like to ask you one question. We signed a lot of agreement. We signed agreement multilateral, I mean Budapest Memorandum, and we thought all this time we thought that we have a guarantees of our peace, sustainable life in our country. Second, we signed bilateral agreements. The agreement for friendship with Russian Federation when we recognize our territorial, and a lot of others. I don't want to use your time. Please give me some concrete suggestion what we can sign more to be conserved from all these things, from Russian Federation, from all these propaganda attacks, from information. All of us laugh when we say that we are Nazi or neo-Nazi. It's unpredictable and unsustainable for us. Mm-hmm. But please tell us what kind of agreement can support us and defend our country. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, personally,
Maxim, yes.
I don't think there's any point signing agreements with Russia. This is a country which has poisoned, using radioactive weapons, people on foreign soil and lied about it. It has assassinated political dissidents in European capitals and lied about it. It's had ceasefire agreements time and time again with Ukraine in the war, over the war in Donbass, and lied about them. At this point, how can you continue to trust a piece of paper that you signed with Russia? I mean, the argument, okay, will be that we trust what the US or the UK or Europe says, but the Budapest Memorandum is a great example of why you can't necessarily trust that, because a generation passes and those agreements are forgotten about. I think at this point we need to be matching words with action, and there are still a lot of things that I mentioned that even Europe can do. A European policing mission, air policing mission. It's possible, Polish jets, Romanian jets are in the air all the time because the missiles are coming close to European borders. Is it too much to say, let's shoot down some of these? Do we think that Putin would go to nuclear war because a Romanian jet shot down an unmanned Russian drone? Mm-hmm. I don't think so.
Yeah. There was another question from the audience that I saw. Please, a gentleman in the third row, I believe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Massimo Moratti. I'm from Osservatorio Balcani Caucaso. And well, in the light of the title of this conference, Protecting Humanity, and if we think about a frozen conflict, a new frozen conflict, I mean, what can we do to really protect humanity? So, I mean, preventing the forcible Russification of the areas currently under Russian control, transfer of populations, and eventually return of refugees and those displaced. I mean, is there any discussion being made about these things at the negotiating tables, or what can we as an international community do? Thank you.
Is anyone here? Please.
Okay. To my mind, now, in defense of humanity, we need, as soon as possible, to end hostilities. And it's open possibility for discussion on all other questions. It will be not easy. And answer to the question of Ambassador, what another agreement we need to prevent Russia from the future aggression, possible future aggression against Ukraine, to my mind now it's obvious. We need to be a member of NATO or to conclude bilateral, legally binding security agreements with some NATO countries or with group of NATO countries, like United States concluded with South Korea or with Japan, or like Turkey concluded with Azerbaijan. So it will be answer. We need more weapons, more finance, more sanctions against Russia to establish sufficient deterrence mechanism for some period of time. And after this, I believe we repeat in future some kind of détente, and in future we manage to reestablish international order, European international order. But it's a long perspective, as to me.
Yes. There was also another question from the audience. Please, middle section, second row.
Hi, Stefan Miliusz, Voice of America. Yesterday we heard news that America, Britain and France allowed Ukraine to use long-distance missiles to attack even maybe Russian territory. How much is that news important? What could be the consequences to European security, considering that Moscow stated earlier that that move will be considered as an escalation move and that it will put NATO and EU in the war? However, how do you see next couple of days, weeks, or even months? Thank you.
Shall I?
Would you like to answer that?
You know, this logic that Western moves have been triggering escalation in the last 3 years has not really been proved empirically, right? I mean, obviously escalation has happened, and it has tended to be the consequence of a Russian move. Think now of the decision to deploy 11,000 North Korean troops in this war. Incidentally, this is, you know, how many decades have passed since East Asian troops were on European soil? Right? So, I mean, this is really significant. And obviously, this wasn't a consequence of any decision that the West took. So, you know, I think we have been our own victims by essentially, you know, sort of falling into this narrative of whatever we do ends up being as part of escalation. Now, I think welcome as it is, the decision that has been taken, I just wanted to say 2 things. Firstly, just the tragic irony of this. I mean, frankly speaking, the fact that this is only happening now, when, you know, if it's happening now, then presumably we weren't so scared about the escalatory, you know, sort of impact that this would have had. So, you know, I think the kind of ethical sort of dimension to this is really makes me feel extremely, extremely uneasy. And secondly, you know, hopefully it will be, and it will have some effect, especially if the US decision is followed by France and the UK, and the big question then is obviously back to Taurus and Germany. But probably it's going to be far less effective than what it would have been had it been taken 6 months, a year or so ago.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for your question. I think it's a very natural question, but especially after last week, the most heavy Russian rocket and drones attacks against Ukrainian civilian population, Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and Putin did it after call conversation with Scholz. In this situation, this decision very natural, because the only one way to press on Russia to start any negotiation, just negotiation on sustainable ceasefire, it's press on Russia from position of strength. So we need it now. We have no choice. And to my mind, people here in Belgrade very clear understand Ukrainian people in Kyiv and other cities, because your expertise, your experience, your historical experience, your memories are very close what now Ukrainian people feelings when they are object of everyday direct rockets and drone attacks against civilians' purposes.
Okay, our time actually expired, but yes, we are in red zone. If you would be very quick about it and we get a very quick answer, can we do it? Yes, we can do it. Please.
Okay, so my name is Angel Petrov. I work for a Bulgarian news outlet called Dnevnik. We've heard two visions during this one-hour panel. One is about Ukraine not going through its last war. Okay, the hot phase will turn cold, maybe with the prospect of one day again turning hot. The other one of Ukraine getting NATO security guarantees, regardless of how you form it, not beyond ceasefire line, etc. Do you think these visions can mutually coexist? Isn't it either or? Because if it's not either or, you have to sell to the European public that we are going to war with Russia one day. And this will be a tough sell, I think.
Would you like that? Yeah.
I would like to, I have a very short answer. First and foremost, let me clarify, there is no signal towards direct NATO-Russia war. Okay, that is very important on both sides. There are no signals towards preparation, because we saw what preparation means 2 times in 2021 in April, and then later in November, December. There are no preparations whatsoever. There is a lot of rhetoric, which of course is also important when you are in a state of war, to keep your domestic audience kind of alerted. But neither NATO nor Russia want, and NATO, I mean NATO members, want any direct confrontation or are preparing for such. That is very important. Second important point, so far there hasn't been a single case of NATO member attacking militarily Russia in the history of this relationship, nor was any single case of Russia militarily attacking NATO member in the history of the relationship. I think a lot is a political rhetoric, but let's look at the realities on the ground. In fact, I would even go further. I would even go further by claiming that Ukraine has been militarily attacked because it wasn't NATO member. Right. Had Ukraine been NATO member, it would have not been actually attacked by Russia. But okay, this is of course meant for another discussion. Fourth important point, of course, Putin also has to appeal to his audience. And of course, he will present this now as a nuclear brinkmanship, as a direct confrontation whatsoever between NATO states and Russia. But what's happening in reality, and this is what I was alluding to, Iron Curtain 2.0, Cold War 2.0, these are hard geopolitical realities. We still, I would argue here in Europe, we still do not want to face. Our public is not prepared for, because it's very hard for the political decision makers. Now we are seeing already beginning of preparations. Think of Sweden, for instance. They've just launched actually a manual how to prepare the own population for war. And then, of course, final point. European audience, because the European Union has been and is rightfully a peace project, has dealt with the, with the eternal peace, and is not prepared also in terms of mindset that war does not mean only being waged by military means. The war that's being waged against the Europeans by Russia is practically by non-military means. It's a non-conventional war, and this is the final point I want to make for the sake of intellectual, engagement.
Yes, and on that point, we are going to end this panel, being already 5 minutes in red zone. Thank you very much. Thank you all, and thank you for listening.